Thanks for joining me. My name is Sean Egglestone and I'm a registered dietitian. And recently I came across a presentation on YouTube presented by a physician named Dr. Peter Attia. And in this presentation, he goes over a study that looks at the performance of low carbohydrate diets compared to low fat diets, and why the low carb diet performed much better than the high carb diet. And I think that the study is flawed. I think the way that he presented the information is very misleading, and I would like to actually go over some of the information that he presented and the study itself and show you why it's just a bad study and why he's giving bad advice.
So this is actually a great study that was done by Jeff Volek and Steve Finney, among others. This was a study that looked at 20 obese patients. These patients were randomized into two groups. The first group was on a carbohydrate-restricted diet. The second group was on a low-fat diet.
So I went ahead and got myself a copy of the study, and I decided to investigate how did they actually get the results that they did, and why didn't the high carbohydrate diet perform better. And one of the major findings that I discovered is that the high carbohydrate diet was actually complete garbage. The types of carbohydrates that they consumed were bad. They potentially had a lot of added sugar, white flour, and junk food, and that's why the high carbohydrate diet didn't perform as well as a low carb diet, is because the high carb diet was a really unhealthy high carbohydrate diet. So keep in mind here, the macronutrient ratio for the high carb, low fat diet is 56% calories from carbs, 24% from fat, and 20% from protein. Now, one of the things that I thought was really convenient that Dr. Peter Attia did was that he neglected to include dietary fiber in the chart in his presentation. So he actually cut out some of the data from the chart of this study. So yes, both groups, here's the carbohydrate restricted group, here's the low fat, high carb group. So both groups did reduce their calorie intake, and that's probably why we saw a benefit. But one of the things that we notice is that their fiber intake was awful. So at 16 grams of fiber at the beginning of the study, 17 grams at the end. So this means that their diet was really not healthy. They had 208 grams of carbohydrates to 17 grams of fiber. So one of the things that I look at when I'm examining this diet to tell if the diet is actually healthy is I look at something called the carbohydrate to fiber ratio. So looking at this sheet, if the participants consume 208 grams of carbs to 17 grams of fiber, that gives them a carbohydrate to fiber ratio of 12:1. Now, as a dietitian, I recommend a carb to fiber ratio of about 5.5:1. So what does this mean? This means that, well, let's look at some common foods. Here are some fruits and vegetables. They have a carbohydrate to fiber ratio of 2:1, 3:1, 6:1. So this means that for every 6 grams of carbs, 1 gram of fiber is consumed. So what this means is when we look at this bottom portion here, white bread has a carb to fiber ratio of 11:1, potato chips, barbecued Fritos, French fries, cookies. This is where their carbohydrates were coming from. This lets me know that, well, why did the high carb diet not lose as much weight? Why did the high carb diet didn't have as good improvements in their lipid panel or their insulin sensitivity? Well, because they were eating junk food. Now, another way to look at this is if they had 208 grams of carbs to 17 grams of fiber is what they had at the end of the study. So how could they consume 17 grams of fiber? Well, if they had a diet that was simply based on Fruit Loops, they got all of their carbohydrates just from Fruit Loops. So 208 grams from Fruit Loops, they would have consumed 24 grams of fiber. So what this tells me is that at best, they had an additional 5 teaspoons of added sugar and potentially as much as 29 teaspoons of sugar during the day. And there's another way that we can tell that they had added sugar in their diet. So if we pretend to be participants here in this study and say, well, we're actually going to eat kind of healthy. We're going to be in the high carb group, and we're going to have, we're going to have 2 servings of fruit per day, and we're going to have 3 servings of vegetables. So 5 servings of fruits and vegetables. We're going to have some whole grains from whole wheat bread and some brown rice. So these foods are all what I consider healthy foods. Now, if we do the nutrient analysis on this, what we find is that this adds up to about 17 grams of fiber, which is where these study participants were. They consumed 17 grams of fiber. But these foods only give them roughly 100 grams of carbs. So where did their other 100 grams of carbs come from? Because remember, they had 208 grams of carbohydrates. This is how we know that one of 2 scenarios took place. They either consumed a diet that was high in carbohydrates and low in fiber by consuming junk food such as white bread, Fruit Loops, chips, crackers, and cookies and pizza, or they did consume healthy food. But in addition to the healthy food, they had to have consumed soda and juice and other foods with added sugar, such that it would raise their carbohydrate intake to 200 grams a day without increasing their fiber intake. Well, here I put together a mock diet. It's going to have the same carbs, fat, and protein ratio as that which is found in the study. I standardized for calories, grams of protein, grams of carbohydrates, grams of fiber is the same as in the study, and I also controlled for saturated fat and cholesterol. So this diet here would be identical in these values compared to the high carbohydrate group. So what could these participants possibly have been eating? Well, for breakfast they had a bowl of Fruit Loops and decided to have a banana. And then for lunch they had a chicken sandwich on white bread with a little bit of mayonnaise, some lettuce, and some tomato, and they had an apple on the side. But for dinner, they didn't do too good. They actually had 2 slices of Domino's pepperoni pizza. So is this diet healthy? Absolutely not. Does it have any whole grains? Nope. Does it have any beans? Nope. So this is a really unhealthy diet, and yet it meets the inclusion criteria for the high carbohydrate group. That is how I know that these participants did not consume a healthy diet, and that explains why they performed so poorly in this experiment. This is another important table that was left out of Dr. Peter Attia's presentation, and this shows that while the low carb group did lose more weight than the low fat group, the low carb group actually lost more muscle mass than the low fat group. So here we can see on this line that the low carb group lost 3.5 kilograms of muscle tissue, whereas the low fat high carb group only lost about 1 kilogram of lean tissue. This graph actually favors the low fat diet over the carb restricted diet in my professional opinion, because it's not always about total weight loss. It's where that weight is coming from. And when we lose muscle mass, we're actually impairing our metabolism because muscle burns calories. And when we lose muscle mass, we're actually losing the ability to burn more calories over a long period of time. And this will have detrimental effects long term for these participants. So what have we learned today? Looking at their carbohydrate to fiber ratio, we know that they consumed a diet that was high in junk food. If they did consume any whole grains, beans, or fruits and vegetables, they would have had to offset that with soda or straight pure sugar as a way to raise their carbohydrates without affecting their fiber intake very much. Now, it's sort of scary that they actually saw improvements at all, and that just means that their starting diet was so unhealthy that they can literally eat Fruit Loops, white bread, and pepperoni pizza and still have an improvement in their weight and their lipid panel. Now, one of the questions that we have to ask is, well, why did the low carbohydrate diet do better than the high carbohydrate diet? So we know that the high carb diet wasn't healthy at all, and we know that based on that sample menu that I showed you. But it's not that the low carbohydrate diet was actually healthy. That's not what the study is looking at. They're not looking at the healthfulness of these diets. They're just looking at the distribution of the macronutrients. And they're looking at which diet performs better than the other. So the low carb diet performs better than the high carbohydrate diet. That doesn't mean that the low carbohydrate diet is healthy or that it actually performs really well in terms of disease risk reduction and helping people get off their diabetic medications and lowering their blood pressure. It's not talking about the actual health benefits of low carbohydrate diets. It's just saying that people did better on the low carb diet than they did on the unhealthy high carb diet, and that both groups did better than where they were initially because their standard diet was even worse. So this just goes to show that macronutrient studies are very, very poor indicators of health or poor indicators of a healthfulness of a diet. And it's really unfortunate when we have people such as Dr. Peter Attia presenting this information, leaving out the fact that their fiber intake was completely insufficient, and ignoring important concepts such as carbohydrate to fiber ratio and looking at what were they actually consuming. And so the audience, unfortunately, is being persuaded to follow a diet that's unhealthy based on the flaws inherent in these kinds of studies. So I hope you found this video helpful. I've recently produced a few more videos that go over this subject of high carbohydrate versus low carbohydrate diets. If you haven't checked out my website, SeanTheRD.com, I recommend that you hop on over there. I've got my position paper on ketogenic diet under the frequently asked questions about why the ketogenic diet is extremely dangerous to follow. And I also have a ton of other videos under the Educate Yourself section. It's a drop-down menu. It's got a lot of other information that you can educate yourself on what a healthy diet is. Thank you so much for watching. Cheers.